All right. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Stephen Coombes to the biomathematics seminar here at UF. He's been a professor in the School of Mathematical Sciences at Nottingham since 2003 and has been an absolutely prolific contributor to the field of mathematical biology and neuroscience using nonlinear dynamics and statistical physics. He has a total of over 200 publications with collectively 7,000 citations. And I'm very, very happy to have him here where he'll share his latest work on understanding the effect of white matter delays on large-scale brain dynamics. Please take it away.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Young-Min. Well, for the invitation and the introductions, very kind of you. Let me just see if I can get the technology to work. How's that? Is it sharing?
Yep, looks good.
Fantastic. So, yeah, I'm an applied mathematician. I work at the Centre for Math, Medicine and Biology in Nottingham in the UK. And if you don't know where Nottingham is, you might have heard of the sort of mythical characters associated with it, Robin Hood and Maid Marian and the Sheriff of Nottingham. You know, that's the part of the world I'm from. So I'm deliberately staying away from talking about coupled oscillators and phase reductions of the type that Young-Min is an expert in, just to avoid the sticky questions from him. Instead, I'm going to focus on a more recent interest of understanding the role of delays in brain dynamics. And so the image on here is a sort of gratuitous color picture of white matter wiring in the brain taken from the Human Connectome project. Okay. So why am I interested? Well, I'm not sure what everyone did during COVID, but I read a bit more than I usually do. There was a very nice sort of semi-popular book about brain dynamics by Douglas Fields that I picked up called The Electric Brain. And one thing that Douglas emphasized was, even to a popular audience, the importance of, white matter in brain dynamics. So it might seem quite obvious because, most of the components of the brain are made up of wiring, but often in theoretical or computational or mathematical neuroscience, we focus on point models of the neuron and ignore the effect of delays. Now, I thought after reading Douglas's book that maybe I could, work in this space a little bit, because I had done some previous work on neural fields. So there's a gratuitous equation here up in the right-hand corner of something that I'd worked on for a long, and many other people have worked on over the years. But it's a model of neural activity, phenomenological. There's a variable u that sits on some space, and you can evolve it forward in time, and the dynamics is expressed of an integral differential equation. And there's delays in the model, and there's non-local connectivity patterns. And we'd studied, these sort of nice pattern forming systems, and been able to analyze, the effect of these delays on the formation of spatial temporal patterns here, visualized with activity on a sphere. But also, we'd done some work with more network style models. So I guess in some sense, this is a continuum model, continuous space. But many people in certainly neuroimaging, when they come to use models in the context of their work, they think about nodes arranged on some network. And we'd also done work recently of a particular neural mass model, the Wilson-Cowan model, which has state variables u and v, which represent notions of saltatory activity and inhibitory activity. And we'd study these networks, so you wire up a network, there's some sort of connections that link node I and J, and you can wire them up and look at all sorts of pattern forming properties on a graph. And we've become interested in the evolution of synchronous patterns. So again, a little sort of cartoon or illustration here of the sort of things we've been interested in. So we take one of these networks, and I tells you which node in the network that you're looking at, and we maybe simulate or analyze maybe n equals 30 nodes, and we ask questions about synchrony. Do these neural mass models, when you wire them up, do they like to do the same thing at the same time, or do they sort of hate each other, they repel from each other? And this is a typical result from a simulation where you see the nodes in the network represented by these blobs. They try and stay synchronous, but they maybe can't manage it. And how synchronous or asynchronous they are will depend upon details of the local dynamics and details of the connection patterns between the nodes. So that's the starting point for me becoming interested in this sort of area, networks with delays, because I read Douglas's book and I thought I knew about delays because I'd studied neural fields with delays, space-dependent delays, and I thought I could easily extend what I'd done with Wilson-Cowan networks without delays to include delays. Okay, so that's my naive starting point. And just a bit of context, just a bit of biology. What is the white matter in your brain? Well, it's a reflection of all the non-local wiring between different parts, of your brain. So 50% of the human brain is dedicated to neural traffic, but I don't think 50% of modelers work on white matter. And of course, one thing it does is allow action potentials to propagate faster than if an axon wasn't wrapped in myelin. So myelin is the fatty substance that really underlies the whiteness of white matter. And oligodendrocytes, these sort of helper cells, are there to sort of wrap axonal fibers in this material to allow fast conduction of action potentials from the cell body along an axon to another neuron. And I'm not going to focus on models of the actual saltatory propagation here, but activity jumps along these axonal fibers between the nodes of Ranvier. And in between the nodes of Ranvier is where the white matter wraps. Typical speeds of conduction you can think of are around sort of 10 meters per second. It's known now that a nice distribution that fits typical human data is the gamma distribution, so a peak around here about 10. And understanding the role of these delays, because obviously if a signal takes a time to propagate along a fiber, it generates a delay, seems highly relevant to understanding theories of neural communication. Because if two different and widely separated parts of the brain need to act synchronously, then the time it takes for a signal to propagate along a fiber will have a huge impact on synchronous patterns. Okay, so now I'm going to start with a toy model. So in our field, in math neuroscience, the Wilson-Cowan is sort of a go-to model for modeling a patch of cortex. It's a phenomenological model, but it keeps track of the activity of a population U and a population V, representing excitatory cells and inhibitory cells. And in this little cartoon here, there's some local wiring. So this population can feed onto the V population, V can feed back, U can self-connect, V can self-connect. There can be external inputs that could represent injected current or inputs from other nodes in a bigger network. And so typically the dynamics for this is written as these two coupled ODEs for U and V. The local dynamics are sort of trivial, there's just decay. And then there's inputs, which are typically linear combinations of the activities of U and V, and maybe a bit of external drive, like this I, that are sort of just passed through a nonlinearity, typically chosen to be a lovely smooth sigmoidal curve. So you get two coupled ODEs with a very smooth nonlinearity here. So of course you can do lots of linear stability analysis on this for sort of steady states, do some bifurcation diagrams. But this nonlinearity really makes it tricky to analyze things like periodic orbits or more exotic behavior, except in a certain limit. So if we make the sigmoid really, really steep, so turn it into a proper switch, a Heaviside, then you can make lots of analytical progress without really destroying the sort of qualitative behavior of the model. So here, I don't know if you've got a good memory, but back on slide 1, there was a simulation of the Wilson-Cowan network. Here, there was a nice smooth sigmoid sitting here, and you get these lovely trajectories in the projected down onto the UV plane. And if you move forward and take the Heaviside limit, you can still get trajectories, but they're obviously the jump points now linked to the jump points in the Heaviside. So the idea is we can say something about the dynamics of this model in the Heaviside limit, because this dynamics essentially becomes piecewise linear. So the u by dt is minus u plus the Heaviside, which is 1 or 0. So it's just piecewise constant forcing. You just need to know, when is this switch on or off? And in between switches, you've basically got either exponential decay to 0 or exponential drive up to 1. So I can really bolt together a periodic orbit from lots of linear things. So that's what we do. So in here, I gave myself the opportunity to have 1, 2, 3, 4 different delays. I'm just going to make my life easy and pick all those delays to be the same. And what I'll show you now is how to construct a periodic orbit, and also how relatively easy it is to determine its stability. And that gives us hope for putting these sorts of models in a network, and also saying things about periodic orbits in a network, and those periodic orbits could be synchronous. Okay, so it's sort of easy or natural to introduce new variables. Here I've sort of got a linear combinations of u's and v's, so I'm just going to do a linear transformation to make this sort of the new variable. And it means I can write my dynamics in this form. The d by dt of the state is a matrix A acting on the new state variables plus some coupling to Heaviside functions, which are 1 or 0. And there's a delay sitting in here. So the big W is the set of 4 connections between the 2 populations, and the J just keeps track of the timescales in the model for me. So kappa is my relative timescale. And let me just show this picture. So now what I've got is I've got these red and blue lines, which I'm going to call delayed switching manifolds. But the idea is you pick some initial data, you evolve it forward. Maybe you're being driven because one of these H's is 1, or both of them are 1. At some point, when you look back in your history, by an amount equal to the delay, you'll cross through one of these switching lines. And that means your H will switch from either 1 to 0 or 0 to 1. And then you begin a new trajectory. If you look back an amount of time tau, again, you'll see a switch, your trajectory will change, and then you can maybe build up a periodic orbit this way. But essentially what I'm going to use is the fact that this system here is piecewise linear, so I can just solve it with really elementary mathematics. So I can use matrix exponentials to write down any trajectory in closed form, parameterized by initial data. Now I'm going to introduce some notation. So T1 will be time of flight along this piece, T2 time of flight along this piece, and so on and so forth. And the period, if I get back to where I start, it's just the sum of all the times of flight. So we look for periodic orbits in a self-consistent way. You pick some initial data. So there's 2 things I don't know. I don't know the time of flight, but I do know that after that time of flight, if I look back an amount of time equal to the delay, I will hit this switching manifold. And that happens in 4 different ways. So there's 4 sort of switching conditions I've got, and I've got 4 times of flight I don't know, 2 bits of initial data. But if I demand periodicity, that gives me 2 more equations. So 6 unknown, 6 equations. So it's not very elegant mathematics, but I can bolt together a periodic solution. Or if you don't like matrix exponentials, it's maybe more natural and more convenient to use Fourier series, because what we do know is we're looking for things that are periodic. So du by dt, in the absence of any input, I've just got decay, and I've got a Heaviside input. I'm just going back to the original variables now. So this H is a Heaviside, but it's only on if its argument is above threshold. So this is what I mean here. So H is either 1 or it's 0, and it switches between 1 and 0 at certain times. So I can think of H, the drive here, as, you know, because it's going to repeat, it's a periodic function. I can write it as a Fourier series with unknown period delta. But then I can go ahead and work out these Fourier coefficients in terms of, you know, when this H is on or off. And I've already parameterized that on or offness in terms of times of flight. So during T1, you know, there's drive, and during T4 there's drive, but in here there's no drive. So what it means is I can parameterize the Fourier coefficients, which I would be looking for to complete my description of the orbit in terms of times of flight. These simple linear equations I can integrate up. You know, H is periodic, so U is periodic. So I can also write U and V as Fourier series, and their coefficients, their Fourier coefficients, can be simply expressed in terms of the Fourier coefficients of this switchy thing here. And again, you just argue self-consistently. I use this trajectory here, U and V. I go back and just use this representation with these switching conditions, and I've already got periodicity for free, really, if I'm using Fourier series, as long as I get the period right. Okay, so two approaches to constructing orbits, and it does work. And I'll show you some examples shortly. But then although I've simplified the model, you know, sigmoids, you know, lovely and smooth. I said we can make progress when we take the very steep limit to get Heavisides. It gives me a big headache when it comes to talking about stability, because I've now got a non-smooth system. So I can't just use tools, some smooth dynamical systems like standard Floquet theory to decide, you know, what's going on. Moreover, I've got a non-smooth system and I've got a delay. So I'm combining two sort of, you know, tricky branches of applied mathematics. But fortunately, it's very easy to combine them. So to do stability, I really have to worry about what happens to a trajectory as it hits a switching manifold, you know, where things change. So although I'm talking here about Wilson-Cowan model with Heaviside, there are many other models in math neuroscience that have switches. The integrated fire model is a classic example. So this cartoon is really a cartoon that encompasses many different types of non-smooth or discontinuous firing model in math neuroscience. So here there's a blue curve, which represents, you know, my unperturbed trajectory. That's the one I'm going to linearize around. And this red one is the one that I've, you know, shifted away. So that's my perturbed trajectory. So typically I define a difference between the two, and I want to evolve that difference and see if it gets bigger or smaller. So on the left of the picture, you know, you've got the difference between blue and red. I've called it delta X. And on the right, there's a difference between blue and red. I've called it delta X. And T is the time of the switch. But something can really, you know, you can't naively use linear stability theory with switches, because although you can assume that the difference between these two things is small before you get to a switch, after a switch, there's no reason why whatever rule you apply at switching would keep the difference between the perturbed and unperturbed trajectories small. So here, this blue curve, I've applied a reset rule, which is sort of in the spirit of an integrate and fire process. But, you know, in the Wilson-Cowan model, it will be just a change in the velocity, a change in the gradient. So really what we'd like to do is take perturbations before the event and relate them to perturbations after the event, and you know, and somehow cope with what goes on in this weird mid-ground where the perturbed and unperturbed trajectories satisfy the crossing condition, the switching, they hit the switching manifold at these slightly different times, one at the original time and one at a perturbed time, delta t. The natural way to do that is to introduce indicator functions. So this indicator function here, H, is just a rule that tells me when the trajectories hit the switching manifold. Now, because I did this linear change of variables, I've got two very simple switching manifolds. So one of the indicator functions is literally called U, or is equal to U. You know, you look back over a time tour, and if U of t minus tau equals 0, that's a switch. And similarly for V. So I'm not going to show you the details of this. I'm just going to give you a heads up that if you've read a bit in non-smooth dynamics and you've read a bit in delays, then there's a natural way or a way to build the perturbations after the switching event in terms of the perturbations before the switching event, if you introduce this saltation matrix or saltation operator K. So if my model was completely smooth, the perturbations just after an event would be the same as the perturbations just before, so I wouldn't have this extra term. But if I want to work out the perturbations just after event, I need to know what they were doing in the past because I've got a delay, and I need to know how to saltate or propagate perturbations through this switching process.
Oh, sorry to interrupt. We have a question from Sergey. Sergey, you're welcome to unmute too, but I'll read it here. So do the solutions ever slide along the switching manifolds?
In the examples I'm giving here, you won't see any of those, but I have constructed some sliding ones as well. So that's a good question. You can get sliding. I'm not going to talk about it. Is that no, I can chat at the end. I can show you some slides if I can dig out some other work at the end.
Yeah, I think we're good with that for now. Thank you.
Okay, cool. Yeah, it's a traditional system where you might need to invoke sort of notions of sliding or complete the dynamics on the switches with a Filipov convention or something like that. So all those sort of cool things from non-smooth dynamics can be found in this particular Heaviside model. Oops. All right, so we're sort of now ready to do the non-smooth Floquet theory, because typically what you do in Floquet theory is you break your perturbations into a time-dependent part, which has the period of the orbit. I'm going to call that Z, times an exponential factor. And if you can find this lambda such that the real part of lambda is negative, then you would be able to classify your periodic orbit as stable. Okay, so this is the class of perturbations I'm going to look at around my periodic orbit. And away from switching, the dynamics is really trivial. You basically got, it's a piecewise constant system, and all the dynamics is encoded in this matrix A. So in each of the four regions of the phase plane, you've got a matrix A telling you what the linear dynamics is. You've introduced this lambda, so the dynamics for these periodic perturbations Z is just this matrix A shifted by lambda. So the idea is you pick some initial data for these Zs, you propagate forward according to this nice linear equation parameterized by lambda. At some point, the periodic orbit switches, so you have to cope with the jumps in the linearized perturbations, and we've got a rule for that. So I've written a little S here, S for saltate. Then you get some new data, you propagate forward. At some point, you have to saltate again. These little red markers just indicate, where you jump. The time at which you jump is delayed with respect to this red marker. There's always a little delay tour. But the rules for saltation are given. These, the new perturbation, is the old perturbation plus some saltation matrix acting on the delayed perturbation. So there's the delayed perturbation Z. There's the saltation matrix. I know what that is. And this exponential factor in lambda just comes out because I've factored it out here. Okay, so the idea is you can write out the perturbations, so pick some initial data, you propagate it forward. This form is really ugly. Pick some initial data, propagate it forward, jump it. Okay, initial data, propagate forward, and this S here tells you the jump. Then you get new data, you propagate forward, you jump, propagate forward, you jump. Okay. So it looks a bit messy. I've introduced some auxiliary functions here, which basically propagators, but they're all depending upon lambda. But the idea is you build up the perturbation as a function of time in closed form, as long as you know essentially what the initial data was, which is sort of buried in these saltation operators here. But there are only other four, in this example, 4 jumps. So any of the 4 things I don't know, 4 bits of initial data. So if you pick 4 different times and use those as the arguments to ZT, you get a self-consistent set of 4 equations. There's 4 things you don't know. You get 4 equations that relate each of those to each other. Okay, so basically you argue self-consistently. There's a little bit of linear algebra. There's a 4x4 system of equations. You want non-trivial solutions. All the trajectories are parameterized by lambda. Demanding non-trivial solutions basically gives you some determinant condition. You get a characteristic equation for lambda, and great, you've got an equation as long as you're good at writing out 4x4 matrices and taking their determinants, so you can work out what the eigenvalues are. So it's a little bit clunky, but it does work. So I'll just give you the illustration. So there's 2 orbits here, one in green, one in black. I've done this trick to work out the lambda by solving a certain characteristic equation. It turns out that these are the roots of a complex function. So I plot the real part of that complex function in the complex plane, and I plot the imaginary part in the complex plane, and I take 0 contours of both, and where they cross, I've got a 0 of my full complex function, and that tells me where the eigenvalues are. So in this picture up here, you can see the red and blue lines cross at 0. So there's a 0 eigenvalue because you would expect time translation invariance. And there are some other eigenvalues just in the left-hand complex plane. So that we would say this orbit is stable. And then in the second orbit, there's some really obvious examples of eigenvalues sitting out the right-hand complex plane. So that one will be unstable. This doesn't work for sliding. You have to work a bit harder for that. So good question about sliding. Okay, so networks. So I take exactly the same model, and I'm thinking now of a network with nodes in it, maybe 100 nodes, and I index those by I, and I need to specify interactions between nodes I and J, but I'm going to keep the Heaviside, and rather than have 4 different delays matrices, if you like, I'm just going to have a between node I and J, there's a delay tau Rj. So I've got a very large set of delays now. Now, to make my life really easy, to avoid lots of complications, I'm not going to consider an arbitrary network to start with, the one that would fit very well with, human connectome data. That will come later. I'm just going to consider something on a ring. And I'm going to assume that the interactions are on the ring are distance dependent, and also that the delays on the ring are distance dependent. So if the delay from node 1 to node 2 is 1, the delay from node 1 to node 3 is 2, and so on. It gets bigger and bigger, and so on and so forth. Why do that? Well, because I really want to show off how to do linear stability analysis. I want to linearize around a nice simple solution, the synchronous one. And by synchrony, I just mean that all the nodes have a common orbit, and let's call that common orbit U bar and V bar. And if I make these assumptions about living on a ring, or basically using matrices that are circular, that these synchronous solutions are guaranteed. So the synchronous solution just evolves according to these 2 coupled ODEs. So it's looking a bit like a single node. Just there's decay, and there's the nonlinear function of a weighted sum of inputs. But now the inputs, these WUUs are the sort of the strength inputs, and these sigmas I'm just saying are some distance dependent strength of interaction that drops away as a power of m. And the tau m's, tau m, if you like, again, tau 2 is twice tau 1, tau 3 is twice is thrice tau 1, etc. So these sigmas here encode the strength of interaction, and because I'm on a ring, I've got some symmetry. So if I go left and right, I can sort of double up in my sums, apart from on the very first term, we have a self connection only of strength of 1, if you like. So this looks like a single node, but instead of having 1 delay, now I've got a set of delays that carry me around the ring. So these tau m's can carry me around the ring. But the method, the matrix exponential method or the Fourier method, doesn't care if you have 1 delay or 1 million. It still works. So I can construct the periodic orbit using that prior method. So here's a periodic orbit. Can you do stability? Well, you can. And the nice thing is, I'm not going to give you all the details, I'll just tell you can. Basically, because I've chosen a nice circulant structure for the connectivity patterns, I can diagonalize my linearized equations of motion, and basically, index things by a set of numbers I'm going to call here Q. But basically, there are modes of the connectivity matrix that I can look at and do linear stability in each of those modes and build up the full nonlinear stability of the synchronous pattern that way. So the idea is between events or switches, you've got nice linear dynamics, so you can freely evolve perturbations here. When you get to here, you need to do this saltation thing, take perturbations across the switches. And at the network level, it's exactly the same idea. So between events, there's a matrix called A bar, which is basically A and a little bit different to the original A. So these are lambda. And the rule for switching is perturbation after the event is the perturbation before. There's a saltation matrix. It's the same one we had before. You feel the perturbations delayed before the switch, but now there's many delays, so you sum over them. There's some strength of connections that are encoded here, and there's an exponential factor, because again, the Floquet theory has separated out this e to the lambda t term, and z is periodic with period of the periodic orbit. So it's the same idea. There's a set of complex functions whose zeros tell me where the eigenvalues lambda are, but now I've got a set of them indexed by q. So if I've got n nodes, I just have to do my stability approach n times.
All right, we have another question from Sergey. Do the modes arise from eigenvectors of a circulant matrix?
Yes, they do. Yeah, exactly.
Cool.
Yeah. And so these plots, maybe they're looking a bit sort of familiar now, but basically there's red and blue lines, and if red and blue cross, there's an eigenvalue. But now there's a family of these sort of pictures, one for each mode. So in this top bit of the slide, there's no eigenvalues in any of these pictures that sneak over to the right-hand complex plane. So, the prediction is that in this network, synchrony would be stable, and that's what you see. In this figure at the bottom, I've changed the parameter, some sort of strength of coupling, and I can excite mode 6 and 7, whatever that means. And so the prediction would be the fully synchronous state is no longer stable. And you see here, the network just breaks into two clusters, a cluster with lots of nodes and maybe a cluster with just one or two nodes. Okay, so Heavisides, they make construction of periodic orbits easy. Stability theory is a bit harder, but it's fine as long as you correct things with knowledge of saltation operators borrowed from non-smooth dynamics. But if you really, really like sigmoids, then it's fine. There are other approaches to dealing with sigmoids. So one approach is sort of really take a big step back and go for scientific computation using, numerical routines for solving delay equations. So you lose a bit of pen and paper ability. Or another approach I'm quite enjoying using at the moment is a harmonic balance approach. So the idea is you take a periodic orbit, caricatured here by this circle, and you say, well, the solution, x, call it, as a function of t, is a periodic thing. So I can write it as a Fourier series with Fourier coefficients a. But then I'm going to sample this orbit at a set of times of my choosing. So I'm going to sample them at multiples of delta, divided by, if you like, the number of points around the ring. And so what that means is you get the state of the system at these sample times, and it's equal to this Fourier series evaluated at those times. And if you truncate your Fourier series, you're really thinking about, an algebraic or linear algebraic structure that relates the samples, x, to the complex Fourier coefficients a. And there's a matrix sitting in here that takes you back and forth between samples and Fourier coefficients, which is just, it's this fixed complex matrix, e to the 2 pi I. times some numbers. So if you truncate this series, then you can use it as a practical tool to, I'm no good at function analysis in infinite dimensional spaces, but now I've got a nice finite dimensional thing. I can use this approach in my ODEs of choice. So here's a sort of a simple version of the Wilson-Cowan decay nonlinear function smooth now of delayed state variable. If you take these sorts of equations and sample them in the same way that you sampled this orbit, then you can end up quite nicely arising at big systems of algebraic equations for these samples. And I'm going to write that algebraic system here. So X are the sort of the samples. There's a matrix S, which is, very easy to construct. There's a matrix omega, which is something to do with this dynamics here. You can see that the one is that decay term, and the 2 pi I is just coming from a derivative here. And then you've got to balance that out with a nonlinear function, that f here, of this delayed state variable. But if you write X in terms of a Fourier series, it's very easy to write its delayed version in terms of a Fourier series. So this gamma here, just really expressing the action of that delay. So this is a big system of linear equations that you can solve in MATLAB or whatever. And again, you can do Floquet theory. You can perturb the orbit with this e to lambda t times periodic thing in Z, and you can write down nice characteristic functions in using these big matrices. So here's a periodic orbit in the single node Wilson-Cowan model with a nice smooth sigmoid. The red and the green are null clines. So there's an unstable steady state here. There's a nice periodic orbit, and you can do stability theory. And here, you only ever see a 0 eigenvalue. So you'd say, well, this orbit is stable. So that's just a little aside. And I'm gonna finish in a few minutes. Because really what I want to flag up is my interest in using this machinery, not just to study networks with fixed delays, but really to get at networks that are learning or plastic. So I think, in computational neuroscience, the synapses get a lot of, they take a lot of the limelight. People talk about learning and synaptic plasticity, but they don't talk about white matter plasticity so much. But white matter plasticity is a real thing. So here in this cartoon, I'm trying to emphasize that the white matter, or the myelin rather, wraps axons, and oligodendrocytes can continue to wrap axons. And it's been found now that if an axon is particularly active, it will get wrapped with more and more myelin. So this brings us back to the sort of more academic work of Douglas Fields. I'm not talking about his popular science book now, but he's done an awful lot of work emphasizing this and describing the biophysics of the wrapping, or the treadmilling, as it's called, and the fact that it can be unwound as well. So you can increase the myelin on a axon and decrease it in an activity-dependent way. So Douglas and others and his colleagues have this very recent nice paper on oligodendrocyte-mediated myelin plasticity. This in eLife, and they've hypothesized that this myelination might play a role in trying to, change the delays between two regions of the brain, such that the end result is the things at either end of that delay, the nodes of the brain, might synchronize more easily. So you adjust myelin to promote synchrony. And I just want to mention the nice work in this, the nice theoretical work by Jeremy Lefebvre and colleagues that have started to look at this in phase oscillator networks, at least to begin with, Kuramoto style, and then more recently, sort of neural mass networks. So the field is ripe for taking your favorite sort of network model and adding delays, and then writing down rules for changing those delays or adapting those delays to respect the biology, and then looking at the consequences then at the network level. So what is the biology that we should respect? Well, there isn't too much for now, I would say. One is just the observation that myelination is activity dependent. There's an interaction between axons and oligodendrocytes. And I think the rule of thumb is that the more active the pathway, the more it gets wrapped. And that this axonal plasticity is slow. It really doesn't occur, over milliseconds or seconds. It's days, months, years. And it's costly. It costs neural tissue to wrap axons in myelin. So what sort of phenomenological models might be natural to start with? Well, one is a model that just says the delay between two nodes is the distance between two nodes divided through by their speed. And then we'll write down phenomenological rules for the evolution of the speed on some long time scale. So I give myself a parameter here, kappa, such that, these speeds have a natural value, C0, but they get driven up if myelin is wrapping the axon. And if you see enhanced metabolism, that's a signature that there's more wrapping. So why don't we focus on a naive model of metabolism that just simply says, metabolic cost. If there's lots of activity on a fiber, here, then we might actually start wrapping more, and that'll require some, we have to pay the metabolic cost. Now, I'm not really representing the fiber here, but I can imagine that if population J is generating lots of activity, that propagates along the fiber to population I. So we can take as a proxy activity along the fiber, something to do with activity in the population. So that will be UJ. But it must take, we haven't really represented the length of the fiber in any way, or the time it takes to send a signal along here. So a simple metabolic cost might be literally the time it takes, the integral of the time it takes to send a signal from here to here. That might be a proxy for metabolic cost. So I'm bearing the delays in this lower limit of this integral. So I've got a network now. It's the same network I had before. I'm going to have state-dependent delays. The rule for the evolution of the state-dependent delays is given by this speed rule and this metabolic rule. So it's another delay model. If you stick to rings, then you can write down the synchronous solution for this rule. It exists. And moreover, if you conveniently assume that all these delays, so these delays aren't fixed now, but if they all evolve to be multiples of the emergent period of this thing, then you won't really see these delays in here because it's a period, it's a periodic function. So one class of solutions you could quickly look at is the ones where you evolve to periodic orbit, all the delays evolve to multiples of the periodic orbit. If you guess that and argue self-consistently, then you can indeed find those solutions. So I'm going to just show here, just says agreement with Sim. So we're beginning to do a bit of theory. I'm looking at my watch. I don't want to bore you too much, but yeah, we can do a little bit of analysis on this plasticity model. But moreover, what we find is that the windows in parameter space for synchrony seem to be much larger now. The delays do indeed settle down to multiples of the emergent period. And we're having fun now, developing all the theory, which, basically is the first part of this talk, coupled with the modeling in the second part and developing the analysis for state-dependent systems. So let me just exit there and jump to the really important slide. Just to recognize my collaborators on this. So I've only really talked about delays today. So that's all joint work with Mustafa. And over the years, I've been lucky enough to work with colleagues at Nottingham, from students to staff, and staff, well, Daniele is now in VU Amsterdam, and Anya was next student, has moved to Dublin. And a little plug, should your library have some spare funds, I've now written a book on neurodynamics aimed at the beginning PhD student or master's student that wants to see how what they've learned about in applied maths or engineering could be mapped over to modeling in neuroscience.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Let's thank our speaker. And do we have any further questions? Could we go to one of your beginning slides? I just wanted to double check.
Yeah.
Something. Trying to remember. Okay, so this is a bit specific, but in 3 slides above. So yeah, so here in the figure, yes. So the figure, the delays are obvious between T1, T2, T2, T3, T3, T4, but between T4 and T1, is it because the velocity is faster there?
It's just it's a tiny delay there. Yeah, it's just
gotcha.
yeah.
So the delays are the same, but it doesn't.
Yeah,
it's not.
That's right. Yeah, even if I zoom in, it doesn't look like there's much of a delay. Yeah, but yeah. Gotcha. You're right. Yeah, these ones are obvious, aren't they? You can sort of see them, but these ones are less obvious just because the velocities are different. Yeah.
Right. And then a lot of this analysis with the Heaviside, it would still work, right, with different delays.
Yes,
it would just be more cumbersome.
Yeah, yeah. So I would say if you're ever thinking about doing something like this, and you may not be, it's very specialized, but the more delays you have, the more cumbersome it is with the matrix exponential approach. But this Fourier approach is just completely agnostic about the number of delays you have. It's really convenient. You just need to know when you're up and when you're down. So I would not use matrix exponentials in practice. But then you might worry about, well, maybe you get some sort of, Gibbs or Stokes effect because, I have to truncate my Fourier series and there's real sharp turns here. So, there's trade-off.
Well, very cool. I enjoyed this quite a bit.
But Steve, I think if you truncate the higher order modes, essentially what you do is averaging.
Right. I mean,
those correspond to higher frequencies, and they will just average out.
Yeah, that's not. I mean, what we've seen in practice for these, when we've done a numerical experiment, we haven't had to have a crazy number of modes. So I was sort of pleasantly pleased. It's a useful tool. But we didn't do any theory. We didn't do any, if you like, numerical analysis, or we didn't try and quantify the truncation error and anything. Just a blunt tool in our hands.
Sure. I'm also curious if you have this network, circular or otherwise, with all these modes, and in the first slide, that when you were talking about stability of those modes, you said that for a certain parameter, all of them are stable.
Yeah.
Right. So that means that there's a lot of unstable stuff in between, right? I mean, if you look at the full state space, so there's got to be something unstable there to separate basins of attraction.
Oh, yeah.
So how complicated that picture is? I mean, do you have any idea?
I'm just imagining it's hugely complicated. That's why I'm quite keen to be at the very start of this journey, because the model is really rich. I've just shown you the really dumb, boring solutions. Sure. So I'm actually starting to do a bit more work with colleagues that know about numerical continuation to try and start, fill out a bit of parameter space, and then but I mean, it's very easy to generate chaos in these models. I don't, one delay and I've got chaos. So
but I'm not even talking about chaos, because even if you have a fairly simple low dimensional ODE system with a bunch of stable, I don't know, attractors, right? So you got to have some separating manifolds they separate the basins of attraction for those, right? And they act like saddles in some way.
Yeah.
I mean, it doesn't have to be chaotic.
Yeah. No, you're right. The if you like, the saddle structure is going to be really rich. That's all I could say. But So this tool, in principle, will allow you to go around and find, start piecing together bits of phase space where you know there's not a stable node or anything like that.
The reason, and again, I'm thinking of I don't know, something like Parkinson's or some such disease where you want to artificially kick your system into a specific basin of attraction, so as to, you know, basically drive it to a certain state so it stays there. And you want to understand, you know, how to do that. So that's why I asked this question, why, you know, how do you go between different basins?
Yeah, so one of the, you know, we're on board with that. So one of the reasons we started building these models, because our colleagues here in Nottingham in psychology, they use TMS to, you know, treat mood disorders or, you know, clinical diseases. And they're very interested in, you know, how do I go from disease to healthy with these kicks where I can only target certain nodes in the network? Because they know that, you know, there's a deep, you know, subcortical node that's really important, but TMS doesn't get to it. But it's, you know, it's connected via a pathway to another node that they can get to. So we're hoping to use these models as ways to help our colleagues, you know, develop new protocols. But then you have to have a reasonable model. You know, it's not just a model of the node, it's the model of the connected system, and the delays are very important. And then for these TMS protocols, it's not clear that the plasticity is really, you know, where is it? Is it on the white matter? Is it on the nodes? Is it in the synapses? So I'm sort of hoping that, you know, some of that TMS style plasticity, which does take a long time to manifest, is in the white matter.
All right, great, thank you.
All right, yes, let's thank our speaker one more time. We really appreciate your time, and have a very nice rest of your day. Thank you.
Yes, likewise to everyone in Florida. Enjoy yourselves.